Hi everyone! Today I want to explore some of the aspects of realism and modernism. I thought at this point of the semester it should be necessary to go over these terms since you will need to understand some of the characteristics of realism if you want to apply them to one of the literary texts in your second paper, right? And we just began reading modernist works this week, so it is always nice to know what kind of literary genres we are reading, right? So let's begin with realism. All the terms relating to literary movement, the term realism is loose and somewhat equivocal. So realism is both a recurring style in literature and the name for a particular period of American literature in the late 1800s to early 1900s, when writers intentionally developed this style in reaction against Romanticism. And in this movement, writers and artists expressed a new commitment to the truthful representation of life as it was experienced by ordinary Americans. Realism was characterized by its literal representations of the particularities of the material world and the human condition. So this passion for finding and presenting the truth led many American practitioners of realism to explore characters and places and events that had never before seemed appropriate subjects. So if we see realism as a style, here, the story provides reality through details of the character and environment. In fact, the presentation of characters as real and believable people outweighs the plot. So, there is this greater attention to detail, and it may create a more detailed setting with potential distractions from simple narrative. And another factor in, if we see realism as a style, the characters are motivated by real-life urges like greed, lust, confusion, more than honor, chivalry, service, and so on. So events will usually be real life with probable results typical of everyday life. Unlike romantic literature with vampires and larger-than-life heroes, realistic stories avoid sensationalism and high drama. Okay? And, if you think about Mary Wilkins Freeman's work, A New England Nun, here we see the character of a New England spinster, rather than a big hero or king or princess, right? And in Bret Harte's The Luck of Roaring Camp, this centered on the commonplace lower-class people like gamblers and workers and prostitutes, common people. And when it comes to speech, speech in realism is more vernacular and idiomatic, like common people of particular classes or regions talk, and unlike romantic rhetoric, that of extreme intimacy or excess. And if we move on to the realism as a period, so in study of American literature by periods, realism begins after the Civil War, succeeding Romanticism, and continues until the 1910s or World War I, when it is succeeded by modernism. So here the shift from Romanticism to realism in American literature in large part occurred because of historical and social changes. The Civil War, the growth of railroad, the telegraph, mass immigration, and rapid industrialization all combined in the late 19th century to transform the United States from a mostly agrarian society to an urbanized one, right? So the hardships of the Civil War, the hard conditions that existed in the urban slums, factories, railroad camps, and mines caught the attention of the writers. So many of them believed that they needed to address this human suffering and the realities of everyday life. So in this sense, realism can be also seen as an attitude of life or a worldview. So the goal of realist descriptions is to understand social conventions that is here and now. The realist concerns himself with the here and now, centering his work in his own time, dealing with commonplace, everyday events and people, and with the socio-political climate of his day. So in terms of social and political appeals, Romanticism loses credibility by being unrealistic. On the other hand, realism deals more directly with the everyday realities, and realist writers saw their job as being similar to that of the scientist, to observe, record, analyze life exactly as they saw it. But in the process, realism also accepts their limits on imagination or possibility as well. And in a broad sense, regionalism and naturalism can be seen as a subset of realism, although some consider it to be a movement in its own right. As you all may well know, regionalism, or the local color movement, sought to preserve Americans' pre-industrial, traditional, and sectional identities on the national scene that exemplified a distinct regional lives that were passing away in the face of urbanism and industrialization. And meanwhile, naturalism emphasizes the pessimistic and fatalistic determinism of environmental and material forces over against individual. So here, nature, the order of things, determines, if not completely overwhelms individual existence. So thus, we can understand realism as a general literary movement that placed emphasis on fact over image, life over dream. But as you can see, there is not one single definition of realism. And indeed, there are many contesting theories and interpretations of realism according to different perspectives. Thus, it is up to you in your second paper how to reinterpret and refine the category of realism in your own works and apply this definition to your chosen text. Alright? So let's move on to modernism then. So I actually want to go over the term modern first, before talking about modernism and modernity. So when we talk about modern, it refers to all things new and in present, and as opposed to all antiquated things and practices, right? So we talk of modern history that relates to recent times, modern lifestyle, modern technology, and modern way of thinking, right? However, there are two words related to this word modern that seems to be confusing, and these are modernism and modernity. And many people think of these two words as same or synonymous. However, it is not so, and there are differences between modernity and modernism. And I think this distinction is quite different to understand, the meaning of modernism. So when we talk about modernity, it refers to the Enlightenment, starting from the 17th century to the mid-20th century. I mean, it would be impossible to define modernity precisely, and the term also remains a highly contested one. Nonetheless, a number of radical shifts in attitude, historical processes, and dramatic technological changes can be observed to have occurred during this period, roughly between 1600 and the end of the World War II, or even now. So when dealing with the problem of modernity, we are dealing with at least 500 years of social, historical, cultural, and political development. On the other hand, modernism specifically refers to a literary period from the late 1800s to 1945. Modernism came as a reaction to the period which preceded it, called modernity. It came specifically to see the world differently and make it new, in the word of Ezra Pound. It sought to break with the principles of modernity, which for some writers and scholars are responsible for the negative turn of events in Europe. Modernism, in fact, criticizes the violent ubiquity of Western culture. And in the widespread suffering and chaos that followed the wars, the older ideals seemed questionable, as did many moral precepts. Modernist poets were therefore concerned with breaking established roles, traditions, and conventions, and finding a distinctly contemporary mode of expression through countless experiments in form and style. So the chief concern was the intricacies of language and how to use them, as well as with writings as an end in itself. So the world seemed to be breaking apart, the meaning of everything was being questioned, and modernism grappled with the fragmentation and complexity brought about by such a state. So the modern poet had a different world from the romantic or realist writers to contemplate, and thus employed new forms and styles as fitting this new disillusioned worldview. Okay, so in order to give an order to an ever-changing world at the start of the 20th century, it disrupted the traditional form of the novel, or the poem, and wrote particularly about nonsense, reworking traditional forms like sonnets, using disjointed structure to reflect the dysfunctional of Western society, addressing inner thoughts of regular people, celebrating simplicity as a critique of materialism of Western culture, and so on. So when you read their poems, the poems of, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Marianne Moore, William Carlos Williams, I want you to particularly pay attention to the former characteristics of modernist literature. Modernist literature is abstract, right? And it is famous for its puzzle, irony, and satire, stream of consciousness, allusions to other words, symbolism, fragmentation. That makes the text quite difficult to understand. And actually here I won't talk about one example, which is T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, or more commonly referred to as Prufrock. It's a poem that uses the stream of consciousness to present dramatic anguish, and it was what made T.S. Eliot one of the greatest poets ever. The character's inner voice trembling and echoing as his thoughts bounce back and forth through his head and out for the reader is what made this poem a prime example for the showing of the technique, the stream of consciousness. And this poem actually provides us with the inner thought of a shy, isolated, pessimistic soul called Prufrock, and like all of the poem itself, Prufrock sheds light on his self-doubting thoughts in lines from 37 to 48 of the poem. Well, due to the time limit, I cannot go into detail of this poem, but I think it's at least interesting to know that Prufrock himself here is fragmented. We do not have a complete image of him, but half image of his morning coat and the collar button to his chin, a modest necktie, and thin arms and legs. Here the bold patch implies that he is middle-aged, but it is more given as a symbolic measure of his embarrassment and nerves than it is as a physical descriptor. And such ontological feelings of fragmentation and alienation are manifested in many other representative modernist poems as well. And indeed, the speaker of modernist poems characteristically wrestles with the fundamental question of self, and in other words, a coherent speaker with a clear sense of himself is hard to find in modernist poetry, often leaving its audience confused and lost. So what I want to tell you is that it is not just you alone that feels confused reading the modernist poems. And you shouldn't expect to understand any poem at one reading, okay? So due to the subtleties that many poems contain, you should read a poem several times in order to grasp the meaning that the poem tries to make. So this can usually be accomplished only after several close readings of the poem, okay? So I hope you enjoy this week's reading, and let me know if you have any questions regarding the second paper or any readings for this week.